The candles in the Vane ballroom burned 3 deep along every wall that night, and the light they cast was the kind of light designed to show a woman at her finest. It showed Eliza Hartwell at her plainest. She stood at the edge of the receiving line in a gown of pewter gray mourning silk, the fabric honest and neat but stripped of every ornament that the season demanded, and the room around her blazed in ivory and primrose and the deep champagne of old money freshly pressed. She was 22 years old and had not expected to be here at all. She had not expected, when the night began, that anything would change. She did not know, as she took her place beside Dorothea's white skirts, that the Duke of Ashford was already watching her from the far end of the room. What she knew was smaller and harder. She knew that her father had been dead for 7 months. She knew that the Hartwell estate had passed by entail to a male cousin she had never met, and that the house where she had grown up was no longer hers to enter. She knew that her stepmother, Lady Maren Hartwell, had settled the question of mourning dress with a single declarative sentence, spoken over the breakfast table 3 weeks before the season opened. Eliza would wear gray until Lady Maren decided otherwise, and Lady Maren had not yet decided otherwise. The machinery of it was not cruel in any theatrical sense. It was simply efficient. Dorothea required a foil. A girl in white silk needed contrast to look her best, and gray beside white was a painter's trick that cost Lady Maren nothing. Eliza understood this. She had understood it for 2 seasons already, moving through ballrooms as a kind of negative space, the plain thing that made the bright thing shine. She was a problem that had been solved by making her useful. She held her fan without opening it, and watched the room fill. Lady Constance Vane received guests from a gilt chair near the upper landing, her jewels so numerous and heavy they seemed to pin her to the spot. She was the season's arbiter in the way that a particular judge is an arbiter. Everyone knew it, everyone deferred to it, and no one spoke the title aloud. She had known Richard's late wife, had brought her out into the season herself some years ago, and her connection to the Ashford household was therefore the oldest kind, the kind built on grief rather than convenience. It was Lady Constance who had invited the Duke of Ashford to the ball, and it was Lady Maren who had understood the invitation's implication and dressed her daughter accordingly. The whisper reached Eliza before the first dance was announced. It came from the cluster of women nearest Lady Constance's chair, 3 matrons in their finest, their fans moving with the practiced rhythm of women who had spent 30 years encoding information in the angle of a wrist. Eliza could not hear the words exactly, but she heard the shape of them. She heard the pause, and then the low musical sentence, and then the gentle collective exhale that meant someone had said something true and satisfying about the order of the world. She caught one phrase intact, the gray one, hardly worth noticing. She did not let her expression change. This was the skill she had spent 2 seasons perfecting. Across the room, near the doors that opened onto the upper terrace, a man stood alone. He was 31 years old, and tall enough that the candlelight caught the planes of his face from below, sharpening the jaw, deepening the set of his eyes, which were the gray of winter river water before it freezes. He had not moved since arriving. He was watching the room with the practiced stillness of a man who has learned that the room costs less if he does not join it, and his expression told no one anything useful. The Duke of Ashford had been in London for 4 days and had attended 3 events out of a precise social obligation to Lady Constance, to whom he owed a debt of a different kind than money. He had not expected to stay long at this one. He was not watching Dorothea. He had noticed, when the Hartwell party arrived, a sequence of small, specific things, the way the gray-gowned woman moved behind the white-gowned one, not quite in step, as though she had practiced the subordinate position so thoroughly it had become a form of independence. The way she held her fan closed while every other woman in the room employed hers as a social instrument. The way her chin stayed level, not raised in defiance and not lowered in deference. Simply level, as though she had decided a long time ago what height the world required her head to be at. He filed the observations the way a careful man files a document he is not yet sure how to name. He did not speak to her that night. Not yet. The first hour of a ball was its own kind of examination, and Eliza had sat examinations before. She accepted a glass of ratafia she did not particularly want, and stood near enough to Dorothea to perform her function, which was to smile appropriately and speak when spoken to. Lady Mourning circulated with the ease of a woman in her natural habitat, trailing her daughter through introductions with the precision of someone who had rehearsed the route. Dorothea was 20 years old, and perfectly instructed, and genuinely beautiful. And she wore her confidence the way she wore her gown, as something that had been fitted to her by someone else, at some expense, and maintained carefully since. Richard watched the room. His solicitor, a careful man named Hobbs, whom he had brought from Ashford Park specifically, stood at the periphery near the card room, and the two men had exchanged exactly 3 sentences across the evening thus far, none of them concerning Dorothea Hartwell. Lady Mourning approached him between the 3rd and 4th dances. She was a handsome woman in her middle 40s, with a smile calibrated precisely to the social weight of the person receiving it. She offered the Duke of Ashford the version of the smile reserved for earls and above, which was warmer than the one for viscounts, and considerably more deferential than the one she employed on tradespeople and relations. She said everything appropriate. She introduced Dorothea at the correct moment and allowed the correct silence to follow. She touched on the season's pleasures, on Lady Constance's magnificent rooms, on the fine attendance. Richard responded with the minimum number of syllables that courtesy required. His eyes moved, once to the woman in gray standing 15 feet away, who was watching a young couple near the windows with an expression of such complete and genuine attention that she had temporarily forgotten to perform anything at all. He returned his gaze to Lady Mourning. "Your other daughter," he said. The temperature of Lady Mourning's smile adjusted by a fraction only a very careful observer would have measured. "My stepdaughter," she said. "Miss Hartwell. She is recently bereaved, as you see. She attends only to keep Dorothea company." "I see," said the Duke of Ashford, and moved away to speak with Lady Constance. "If this is the kind of story you find yourself unable to leave, you are in the right place. Stay a while." Eliza retreated to the library passage at the midpoint of the evening, when the dancing had grown loud and Dorothea had been claimed for a set, and she was briefly, mercifully, invisible to everyone. The passage was a narrow corridor connecting the ballroom's east wall to the Vane library, lit by 2 candles set in a wall sconce, and it smelled of beeswax and old paper, and the particular dusty composure of a room where serious things had been kept for a long time. She had found it at the ball 2 seasons prior, and had remembered it with the careful gratitude of someone who does not expect comfort to persist. She was not alone when she arrived. A young woman sat on the bench at the passage's end, pressing a folded letter to her sternum with both hands and breathing in the quick, shallow way of someone who has been frightened and is attempting to stop. She was perhaps 19, dressed expensively, but without the polish of a woman who had spent more than 1 season in this world. Eliza recognized her after a moment. Sophia Renwick, newly widowed at 18, attending the season under Lady Constance's formal protection. Her husband had died before the year's end, leaving her an estate in Suffolk and very few friends in London. And the gossip about her had been running ahead of her all week, like a footman with bad news. The letter was not Sophia's. Eliza saw this in the way the young widow held it, not possessively, but desperately, the way one holds a thing that belongs to someone else and that one has no idea what to do with. The wax seal had been broken. Someone had read it. Sophia's face, when she finally looked up and saw Eliza, contained the specific expression of a person who has made a mistake they cannot undo, and who is searching the nearest available face for evidence of whether it will destroy them. Eliza sat down on the bench beside her without asking permission. She said very quietly, "Whose is it?" Sophia named a name. A young woman of middling family who was dancing the current set in the ballroom, whose reputation, if the letter's contents were what Sophia's expression suggested, could not withstand what was written on those pages. Eliza held out her hand. Sophia gave her the letter without speaking. What Eliza did with it was simple and took precisely 4 minutes. She found the young woman between figures, pressed the folded pages into her hand with a single quiet sentence, and returned to the passage before the set had resumed. She had not asked for gratitude. She had not explained how she came to have it. She had created no witnesses, left no debt, opened no opportunity for credit. The act had cost her a specific social exposure. Leaving the library passage for the ballroom floor without a partner and without a chaperone's supervision was precisely the kind of small irregularity that Lady Marin would learn of by morning and use accordingly. Richard had entered the passage from the terrace door at the far end 4 minutes earlier, returning from the cold air outside where he had been standing in the particular stillness of a man who has learned to manage grief with fresh air and his own company. He had stood in the shadow beyond the sconce's reach and seen all of it. He said nothing when she returned. He was already gone when she reached the bench again. She did not know he had been there at all. 3 years ago, in the blue bedroom at Ashford Park, the Duchess of Ashford had died at dawn on the 14th day of January, and the child had not survived the hour. Her name had been Catherine. She had been 24 years old, and the finest person Richard had known in any station, and he had spent the preceding 3 years trying to determine what precise failure on his part had produced an outcome that physicians told him could not have been prevented. He had not succeeded in exonerating himself. He kept her portrait in the library at Ashford Park, turned face to the wall, not because he wished to forget her, but because he had not yet found a way to look at her without the specific weight of blame settling across his shoulders, like a yoke. Mrs. Peel, who had served the household for 30 years and knew the weight of silence, did not comment on the portrait's position. She dusted the frame regardless. He thought about the gray-gowned woman in the passage for the remainder of that evening and said nothing about it to anyone. The second dismissive label reached Eliza the following afternoon. Lady Constance had called on Lady Marin, which was a social distinction usually reserved for women of equal or superior station, and was therefore a mark of considerable honor. They took tea in the front drawing-room, while Eliza sat at the writing desk in the corner, copying correspondence that Lady Marin had no particular urgency for, but that served its purpose as an occupation for the unnecessary daughter. She was not meant to be part of the conversation. She was a piece of furniture with good handwriting. "The gray one does not help Dorothea's cause," Lady Constance said, not unkindly, simply as a woman reporting observed fact. "She draws the eye precisely because she does not try. I noticed the Duke of Ashford looking at her twice. It is the kind of attention that reads as curiosity, which in a man his age is not comfortable to see, directed at a girl of no prospects." "Miss Hartwell has no prospects," Lady Marin confirmed with perfect equanimity. "She has her father's debts, £4,000 worth, and a borrowed wardrobe. She will be married off the moment the right offer presents itself, and until then, she causes no trouble." Eliza's pen continued its movement across the paper. She did not press too hard. She did not lift her gaze. After Lady Constance departed, Lady Maren paused at the writing desk. She said, without heat, "You will not encourage the Duke's attention. Eliza, he is here for Dorothea. You are here to make the arrangement appear natural. Do not confuse your function." Eliza said, "Of course, ma'am." She had said "of course, ma'am" in variations for 7 months. She had said it for 2 full seasons before that. The words occupied no emotional space in her any longer. They were simply the sound the cage made when its door was tried. Richard encountered her in the garden at the Prentice card party 3 days later. He had come through the side gate, and she had been sitting on the stone bench behind the yew hedge, reading the one book she had brought inside her reticule, because the card party had 40 guests, and a card party with 40 guests contained, in Eliza's experience, precisely no conversation she needed to be present for. She closed the book when she heard his step on the gravel, and stood because one stood for a duke. He said, "Do not stand on my account." She stood anyway because it was not about his account. He looked at the book's cover. He said, "That is a serious choice for an evening assembly." She said, "I find the assembly leaves considerable time for reading." Something moved in his face, very briefly, in the region of the eyes. It was not quite amusement. It was the preliminary condition of amusement, in a man who had been living without it for long enough that the muscle had grown unfamiliar. He said, "I saw you in the Vane passage last week." She had not expected that. The book became suddenly very specific in her hands. She said, "I beg your pardon, Your Grace." "The letter," he said. "The young widow. The woman in the white gown between figures." He paused. "I came in from the terrace while the matter was being resolved. I did not announce myself." Eliza considered several possible responses and chose the most honest. "It required no announcement." "No," he said. "It required precisely the reverse." He looked at her for a moment, not the way men usually looked at women at garden parties, the quick cataloging glance that noted gown quality and breeding marks and dismissed or filed accordingly. He looked the way she occasionally looked at a sentence she needed to understand before she could continue the page. Then he said, "You will take cold, sitting behind a hedge in November," and walked back toward the house. She stood behind the yew for a full minute after he was gone. Her heart was loud in her ears, which was inconvenient, and not something she intended to examine closely. He had said she would take cold, as though her temperature was information he had reason to monitor. She pressed the thought flat like a pressed flower between pages and put it away. The deniable attention continued in the week that followed, and each instance of it was, by itself, explicable. He was seated near the Hartwell party at the Ellsworth dinner and asked Eliza, across the width of a flower arrangement, what she thought of the salmon course. He crossed the width of the Drummond drawing room to retrieve her dropped glove before a footman could reach it, and held it out without ceremony. At the Merton concert, he chose the seat adjacent to hers in the second row and remained beside her for the full duration without speaking, which was its own kind of communication in a room devoted to noise. She misread each instance with the efficiency of someone who has practiced misreading for long enough that it has become reflex. He was being polite. He was being courteous. He was exercising the particular careful attention of a man who notices the dismissed as a matter of moral habit, and nothing more. Lady Maren noticed each instance, too. She said nothing, because Lady Maren was a woman who filed her information and deployed it at the moment of maximum utility. The third dismissive label arrived as a third-party report, delivered by Lady Constance's companion, Mrs. Farrow, to Lady Maren in the Drummond anteroom, in a voice pitched precisely loud enough that Eliza, standing 6 feet distant with her back to them and a cup of tea she no longer wanted, could hear every word clearly. Mrs. Farrow said that Lady Constance had spoken to several senior members of the season's establishment, and the consensus was that the Hartwell girl in mourning gray was doing Dorothea a genuine disservice by attracting notice she was not equipped to meet, that a girl with £4,000 of her father's debt, and no estate, and no connections, was wasting the attention of a man who required a very different kind of alliance, and that Lady Marin ought to think carefully about whether Miss Hartwell's continued presence at public events was, all things considered, prudent. Eliza held the teacup level. The cup did not shake, because she had 2 seasons' practice at keeping cups level. The following evening, before the Ashworth dinner where Richard was also expected, Lady Marin came to Eliza's room. She sat down in the upholstered chair beside the fireplace with the posture of a woman who has already made a decision and is informing a subordinate of it as a courtesy. She explained, in measured and reasonable terms, that she had given the question considerable thought. She had spoken with Richard's solicitor, a Mr. Hobbs, on 2 occasions, and she believed she had sufficient understanding of the Duke's intentions to act with confidence. She had spoken also with Lady Constance, whose blessing she had secured. She would be announcing, at the Ashworth dinner, that a formal understanding had been reached between the House of Ashford and the Hartwell family. Meaning, Dorothea. Meaning the arrangement was settled. Eliza said, "Has the Duke of Ashford agreed to this understanding?" Lady Marin said, "The Duke of Ashford has expressed every appropriate indication of interest in this family." She smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her skirt. "He has been attentive. He has been present. The conclusion is natural, and I have drawn it, and Lady Constance has concurred." Eliza heard the £4,000 in the silence that followed. She heard the entail, the estate already gone to the cousin in Shropshire, the 2 seasons of grey gowns, the pen copying letters in the corner of the drawing-room. She heard the full machinery of it, laid out like a debt schedule, and she understood that Lady Marin was not lying from malice. She was managing a situation with the tools she had, and Eliza was one of those tools, and tools were not asked for consent. She said, "Lady Marin," and her voice was very quiet and very level. "I do not believe the Duke has confirmed this to Mr. Hobbs or to anyone else." Lady Marin looked at her for a moment with the expression a careful woman wears when a piece of furniture has spoken. Then she stood and left the room. The dinner was a large one, 34 covers at a table long enough that voices at one end could not reach the other, and the news moved sideways through the room in the fashion that all significant news moves through such rooms, by the mechanism of proximity and whispered repetition, so that by the time the fish was removed, every person present had heard something, and most of them had heard the same something. The Duke of Ashford sat near the head of the table, and his face told no one anything at all. He ate the fish. He spoke to his neighbors in the measured, economical sentences of a man performing a social obligation he has accepted as the cost of belonging to a world he did not fully choose. Lady Marin made the announcement between the removes, in a pause she had engineered with the precision of a woman who has been managing dinner-table announcements for 20 years. She spoke warmly of both families. She spoke of Lady Constance's guidance and blessing. She said that she was pleased to share news that would, she trusted, bring everyone present considerable happiness, and she named the Duke of Ashford and her daughter Dorothea in the same sentence with exactly the warmth and confidence of a woman who has made a true statement. The table responded with the particular quality of approval that Regency drawing rooms produce when something expected has finally been confirmed. Eliza sat 12 places from the head of the table and did not look at Richard. She looked at the candle nearest her, a good beeswax candle burning evenly, and she thought, "He gave no confirmation." She knew this with a precision that had nothing to do with hope, and everything to do with honesty. She had not been watching him for weeks out of hope. She had been watching him the way one watches something that requires accurate understanding rather than wishful thinking. And she was certain. He had given no confirmation. She could remain silent and let the machinery run. It had been running her direction for 7 months, and it would continue to run, and there was no particular reason it should stop. She looked at Richard, finally, and he was already looking at her. His face was still. His eyes were the gray of river ice, and they were specific, and still, and entirely on her. And in them she found not confirmation of the announcement, but its precise opposite. She said quietly to the woman seated nearest her, Lady Drummond, who was the most senior and most fair-minded person within speaking distance. I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Lady Drummond's eyebrows moved a 1/4 inch. She said, I beg your pardon, Miss Hartwell. The announcement, Eliza said. I do not believe the Duke of Ashford has given his confirmation. I think Lady Marin may have misunderstood the nature of his attentions toward this family. Lady Drummond set down her fork. Across the table, someone had heard and leaned toward their neighbor. The table's comfortable murmur began its subtle reorganization. Lady Marin's expression, when she became aware of the sound's changed quality, was the expression of a woman whose instrument has just produced a note she did not authorize. Richard rose from his chair. He did not speak immediately. He stood for a moment in the candlelight with the quality of stillness he carried everywhere, the stillness of a man who spent considerable time deciding precisely what to do before he did it. And the whole table felt the weight of the pause without being able to say exactly how. Then he said, and his voice was the level declarative register of a man who issues commands that are functionally protection. Lady Drummond, ladies and gentlemen. He looked at Lady Marin with the specific attention of a man who is performing a correction rather than an accusation. Lady Marin has been gracious in her confidence. I have not communicated any formal understanding to her or to any member of this party. The announcement, I must tell you plainly, is premature. The table was very quiet. Lady Marin's face held its composure with the determination of a woman who has spent 20 years not letting rooms see her startled. Dorothea's chin lifted a fraction and then stilled, coached enough to manage the surface. Lady Constance, at Richard's right, said nothing. Her fan, held at the measured height that indicated thought rather than approval, was perfectly still. Richard looked at Eliza. He said, Miss Hartwell, if you would. She did not know precisely what he was asking. She understood it completely. She set down her napkin and stood. Now, if this story is reaching somewhere you recognize, stay with it. The best of it is very close. They walked from the Ashworth dining room into the corridor, and then, because the corridor was insufficient for the magnitude of what needed saying, and because the garden was accessible through the east door, into the garden, where the November air was cold and clean, and the sound of 32 dinner guests managing their astonishment drifted out behind them and became a kind of weather. A stone path ran between 2 lines of bare-branched rose standards, and there was a stone bench at the path's end, the kind of bench old gardens place in positions of memorial rather than comfort. Eliza did not sit. She stood on the path and looked at him, because she was done, she realized, with looking at candles and cups and middle distances. She had spent 2 seasons looking at everything except the thing that required looking at, and she was 22 years old, and her father was dead, and the house in Wiltshire was gone, and she had £4,000 of debt she had not incurred, hanging over her name like a sentence already delivered, and she was not going to look at the garden path. He said, I need to tell you something that I have not told anyone in 3 years. She said, You do not owe me a confidence, Your Grace. No, he said. I owe it to the decision I intend to make, which requires that you understand who is making it. She waited. He told her about Catherine. He told her in the careful, precise, stripped sentences of a man who has rehearsed the story only in private and is therefore not in command of its length. He told her that Catherine had been the best of what he thought he knew about goodness, and that she had died in the Blue Room on a January morning, and that the child had not survived the hour, and that he had spent 3 years determining that his coldness had produced an outcome that every physician had told him his warmth could not have prevented. He told her that the portrait stood face to the wall in the Ashford Library, because he had not yet found a way to look at it that did not feel like evidence. He said these things without asking for absolution, simply as a man presenting facts so that the facts could be examined by someone whose judgment he had come, in the space of 3 weeks, to trust more than his own. When he finished, the garden was very quiet. Somewhere in the bare branches above them, a bird made a single sound and stopped. Eliza said, "You did not fail her." He looked at her. "You did not fail her," she said again. And her voice did not shake, because this was not a thing she said to comfort him. It was a thing she said because it was true, and because she had formed the conclusion from evidence, and because she would not say a true thing quietly when a true thing needed to be said plainly. A man who fails the people he loves does not spend 3 years in grief. He spends them in relief. You have been carrying guilt for an outcome that was not in your authority. That is not failure. That is love with nowhere to go. He was very still. The cold air moved between them, and she felt the warmth of him at 2 feet's distance, which was not a distance that meant anything in a formal social sense, and which felt, nonetheless, very specific. He said quietly, "I intend to speak to Lady Constance tonight, and to your stepmother. Mr. Hobbs has been working since yesterday morning on the particulars of the £4,000 debt. It will be settled before the weekends." She said, "You cannot settle my stepmother's debt on my behalf without a formal arrangement." "Yes," he said, "that is precisely my point." She looked at him for a long time. The moonlight was thin and cold on the garden path, and the bare rose standards stood in their 2 lines, like witnesses called without warning. And Eliza Hartwell, who had not expected for 7 months and for 2 seasons before that to be chosen freely by anyone, felt something loosen in her chest that had been wound tight since January, since the word entailed had been spoken over her father's desk, since the gray dress had been laid on the chair. She said, "I am not a woman who requires rescuing, Your Grace." "No," he said. "You are the woman who rescued a widow's reputation in 4 minutes in a library passage without keeping a single thread of credit. I am not here to rescue you. I am here because I cannot account for the past 3 weeks except by this explanation, and this explanation requires a question." He asked it. She was quiet for 3 full seconds, which in a garden in November with that quality of stillness is a very long time. She said yes. They returned to the Ashworth dinner, and the room they entered was not the room they had left, because a room in which something is expected is a different instrument than a room in which the expectation has been overturned and is waiting for its resolution. Richard spoke first to Lady Constance, because this was correct, because she was the senior authority in the room, and his connection to her was real and old and deserved the courtesy of a direct address. He told her, in the measured sentences of a man making a formal statement, rather than an announcement, that he wished to make his intentions known to the assembled company. He said that he had spoken with Miss Hartwell in the garden, and had received her answer, and that he had directed Mr. Hobbs to begin the settlement of the Hartwell debt of £4,000, as a matter of immediate priority. He used the word Duchess in the sentence where it was required, and the sentence where it was required was the sentence addressed to Lady Constance and the room together, clear and level, and not a syllable longer than necessary. Lady Constance's fan dropped by a half-inch. She was quiet for a moment, the specific quiet of a woman recalibrating a set of conclusions she had held with considerable confidence. Her eyes moved to Eliza, who stood still and straight in the pewter-gray gown without apology or triumph. And something in Lady Constance's expression shifted from surprise into the slow, warm movement of genuine recognition. She said, "Then we are pleased, Your Grace." And she meant it, because Lady Constance was a woman whose identity was organized around her position, but whose judgment, underneath the position, was sound. Sophia Renwick was in the room. She had been seated near the lower end of the table and had heard everything, and she rose now from her chair with the careful deliberateness of a woman who knows the social cost of standing when protocol suggests sitting and has decided to pay it. She said, to no one specifically, and therefore to everyone, "Miss Hartwell is exactly the woman she appears to be. I have direct knowledge of her character, and I vouch for it without reservation." She sat down again. She did not elaborate. She did not need to. Lady Mourning said nothing. Her face held its form with the final discipline of a woman who has spent her whole life in rooms that required her to hold form, and she held it now because there was nothing else available to her. Dorothea sat beside her mother with her chin at the precise trained angle. And what Dorothea felt in that moment, underneath the training, was something too complicated and too honest to be called simple disappointment. Because Dorothea had been watching Richard for 3 weeks also, and had known, if she was truthful, that his attention had never been for her. She had known it, and had let her mother build the announcement anyway, because the alternative had not seemed possible. And now the alternative was standing in a pewter gray gown across the table, and had been asked a question in a November garden, and had said yes. Dorothea looked at her plate. Lady Mourning looked at the wall. Richard crossed the room to where Eliza stood, which was the short version of the longer event, and did not capture the quality of those 4 or 5 strides across the Ashworth dining room carpet, the way the candlelight tracked him, the way the company fell into the particular attentive quiet that rooms produce when they understand they are witnessing the thing they will describe to their grandchildren. He stopped before her and looked at her with the gray eyes she had spent 3 weeks misreading, and said nothing at all, because the saying had been done, and what remained was not a sentence. He offered her his arm. She took it, and they left the room together. And the sound behind them was the sound of the season adjusting its understanding. Mr. Hobbs confirmed the settlement of £4,000 the following morning, and delivered the papers to Lady Mourning's solicitor before 11 o'clock. The debt that had hung over Eliza's name since her father's estate was counted and closed, was discharged in a single transaction, efficiently and without ceremony, because Richard operated in the understanding that the procedure was important, but that the importance was in what it freed, and not in the procedure itself. The Hartwell party departed London a week later. Lady Mourning and Dorothea returned to the house on Bruton Street that Lady Mourning rented by the season. They were not turned away from future events. The correction they had received was social and specific. The announcement had been wrong, and the wrong had been publicly named. And the season had registered it and moved forward. Because seasons do not dwell. Dorothea would have another season. Lady Mourning would revise her calculations and present them again with the same careful attention to light and contrast. The machinery would continue because machinery always continued. It had simply been overridden, for this woman, in this room, by someone with the authority and the perception to do it. Eliza came to Ashford Park in December. The house stood at the end of a long approach lined with old oaks that had lost their leaves, and their bare branches crossed above the drive like the vaulting of a very old and very patient cathedral. The stone of the house was pale gray in the winter light, and every window was lit, because Mrs. Peel had instructed the household accordingly. Eliza sat in the carriage as it turned between the gateposts and looked at the windows, and felt something she had not felt since the morning she had understood that Hartwell House was no longer hers. She felt that she was approaching a place that had been waiting. Mrs. Peel met her at the door. She was a small woman of 60, with hands that had carried every kind of household weight, and a face that knew the difference between a person who belonged in a house and a person who did not. She had served Ashford Park for 30 years, through 2 dukes, through Catherine's brief and luminous residence, through the 3 years of turned portraits, and managed quiet. She looked at Eliza for a moment on the front step, in the cold December light. And then she said, simply, "Welcome home, Miss Hartwell." And the formal address was already almost wrong, and they both understood it. The drawing room had a fire. The fires at Ashford Park were the kind built by people who understood that warmth was not an ornament, but a commitment. And this one had been burning long enough that the room was genuinely, fully warm. Snow had begun falling outside the tall windows, while Eliza stood in the hall, and by the time she was settled, it lay in thin white lines along the sills. Richard came in from the library. He had something in his hand that he had been carrying through the east corridor, and Eliza recognized it before he set it down on the writing table near the window. A portrait in an oval frame, the kind of frame that a careful household places on a desk rather than a wall, the kind that says quietly, "This person is not forgotten. This person has been moved from grief into memory, from the wall to the light." The woman in it was dark-haired and gentle-faced, and had been 24 years old when she died on a January morning, and the portrait had been turned face to the wall in the Ashford Library for 3 years. It faced forward now. Richard set it on the table and straightened it once with 2 fingers, a small adjustment, a small act of peace that cost something, and that he made anyway. And Eliza watched him do it with the full attention she brought to everything, and understood that the cost of it was the point, and that the point was that he was paying it in her presence rather than alone, which was itself a kind of declaration. He came to stand beside her at the window, where the snow was falling in the particular silence that snow produces, white against the darkening park. The old oaks along the drive already white along their upper branches. The fire behind them was steady and warm. Mrs. Peel's voice carried faintly from the hall, directing someone to take a care with the good china. Eliza looked out at the snow on the park she had arrived to, and thought of the phrase home in the way one thinks of a word one has known the definition of for years, but only just heard used in a sentence that proves the definition true. She thought of the gray dress folded now in a trunk upstairs, the morning completed at last, the season behind her, the long approach through the oaks. She thought of a garden in November, and a question asked in the cold, and her own answer, which had been 3 seconds long, and which had contained everything she was. He stood beside her in the warm room, and the snow fell outside, and the portrait of Catherine looked out at the December light, and nobody in that house was invisible. She was home. If Eliza's story moved you, leave a comment with the moment you felt it turn. There are more stories here for the evenings when you need one.